Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're diving into this really interesting paper. It's called A Manifesto for a Globally Diverse, Equitable, and Inclusive Open Science. And it kind of gets at this, we've been talking a lot about open science on the show and
Right.
all the, benefits of transparency and data sharing and all that.
Yeah.
But this paper is sort of saying, hey, there's a big piece that's missing here.
Yeah, they're saying that, in this push for reliable research, we're kind of overlooking a big chunk of the world's population.
Right. It makes you think if most psychology studies are, based on people from, very similar backgrounds and cultures, are we really getting the full picture of what human behavior is all about?
Yeah, that's a really good point.
So this paper introduces this new concept called masking,
Masking.
which stands for making assumptions based on skewed knowledge.
I see.
Can you break down for us what is masking and why is it such a big deal for the field?
So masking is basically like, when you're building a house and you build it on a really shaky foundation,
Okay.
if your research is based on a limited understanding of human diversity,
Yeah.
then you're building on that shaky foundation, and the results you get could be totally misleading.
Interesting.
Like, they give this really good example in the paper about a study on well-being in Kenya.
Okay.
And they said, imagine researchers just focus on, college students in Nairobi. They might miss out on, what's going on with the majority of Kenyans who live in rural areas.
Right.
And, their circumstances and their culture could be totally different, and that could affect their well-being.
Wow. That's a great example. It's like, you're getting such a skewed perspective if you're just looking at this one little group.
Exactly.
So how does this paper suggest we, kind of tackle this problem of masking in research?
Well, they lay out a roadmap for researchers.
Okay.
And they really push for incorporating diversity and inclusion into every single step of the research process.
Well,
From how we design our studies to how we report our findings,
Wow.
everything needs to be looked at with this lens.
so it's about being really intentional and thoughtful
Yeah.
throughout the whole process.
Exactly.
I noticed the paper mentions a need for methodological diversity.
Yes.
What does that mean, practically speaking?
So methodological diversity just means recognizing that you can't use a one-size-fits-all approach when you're studying diverse populations. Different cultures, they might have different ways of expressing emotions or communicating,
Right.
even perceiving the world around them.
Oh, that's interesting.
Like, for instance, a survey that measures anxiety might need to be adjusted to take into account how different cultures express and deal with anxiety.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
You can't just assume that everyone's going to experience and show anxiety in the same way.
Exactly.
Well, I imagine collaboration would be really key here,
Absolutely.
especially with researchers from diverse backgrounds.
Totally. The authors are really big on creating partnerships that bring together people with different perspectives and expertise. Like, imagine a team of researchers from different continents collaborating on a study about stress.
Yeah.
By sharing their knowledge and adapting their methods to the cultural context they're studying, they could get a much deeper understanding of how stress works across different cultures.
That's so cool. Sounds like that could lead to some really groundbreaking insights.
Definitely.
So, okay, we've designed our study. We've gathered our data from a diverse sample.
Right.
Now, how do we report those findings in a way that's accurate but also responsible, especially when it comes to making sure we're not further marginalizing underrepresented groups?
Yeah, that's a really important point. I think transparency is key here.
Okay.
Researchers need to be upfront about who they studied, where the study took place, and any limitations in their findings.
Yeah.
It's about acknowledging potential biases and being really careful with language that could reinforce stereotypes.
Right. So being sensitive to the language we use.
Exactly.
I noticed the paper talked about these constraints on generality statements.
Yes, COG statements.
COG statements.
Yeah.
Can you tell me a little bit more about those?
Sure. So COG statements are basically a way of being upfront about the boundaries of your research.
Okay.
So instead of making these big, sweeping claims about human behavior based on a limited sample,
Yeah.
you can use COG statements to say, hey, these findings might not apply everywhere or to everyone.
It's like an honesty check.
Exactly.
Saying hey, this is what we found,
Yeah.
but it might not be the whole story.
Right. And it encourages other researchers to do more research with different populations.
Oh, that's great. So it's not just about saying, oh, we're limited. It's about saying, hey, let's build on this.
Exactly.
That's awesome. Okay, so we've talked about acknowledging limitations, but how do we actually become more responsible about drawing conclusions from our research, especially given that certain populations have been, like, historically overrepresented in research.
Yeah, and that's where the concept of questionable generalizability practices, or QGPs, comes in.
QGPs, right?
Yeah, and this ties into a really cool tool that you mentioned earlier, the missing majority dashboard.
Right. The missing majority dashboard.
Yeah, and this dashboard highlights like how skewed the authorship patterns are in psychology.
It's like who's actually doing the research and whose voices are being heard.
Exactly.
And it's often a very limited group of people.
Right, and that limited representation, it can really influence the questions researchers ask, the methods they use, and how they interpret their findings.
Right. It's like this cycle where certain perspectives are kind of prioritized.
Exactly.
And other perspectives get left out.
Yeah, and that means we could be missing out on a ton of knowledge.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
It really makes you think about how much richer our understanding of human behavior could be if we could break free from these limitations.
Definitely.
So this manifesto is calling for a pretty big shift in how research is done and evaluated.
It is. It's a call for a more inclusive and collaborative approach to research.
One that embraces diversity and really tries to understand human behavior in all its complexity.
Absolutely. And the potential payoff is huge. We could end up with a much more accurate and beneficial understanding of human behavior for everyone.
It's a really inspiring vision for the future of psychological science.
It is.
Yeah, it really is exciting to think about what's possible if we can embrace this, this vision of a more inclusive open science.
Yeah, definitely.
So what are some of the concrete steps that researchers can take to actually, move in this direction?
Well, the manifesto lays out a whole roadmap for researchers.
Okay.
With like specific actions they can take at each stage of the research process.
Oh, cool.
So like when it comes to designing research, they really emphasize being thoughtful about the population you're studying.
Yeah.
And the cultural context. It's not just about collecting data from diverse groups. It's about doing it in a way that's sensitive to their unique experiences and perspectives.
So it's not just about like checking a box.
Exactly.
It's about really like engaging with the nuances of different cultures and backgrounds.
Okay.
Can you give me like an example of how that might play out in a real study?
Sure. So let's say you're studying parenting styles.
Okay.
A parenting style that might be considered authoritarian in one culture could be totally normal and effective in another culture.
That's true. It depends on the cultural norms.
Right.
Yeah.
So you have to understand those norms and values when you're designing your study.
It's about the why behind the differences, not just the what.
Exactly.
What about when it comes to reporting our findings?
Okay.
What are some things researchers should keep in mind?
Well, again, transparency is really key.
Okay.
So being upfront about your sample, about the context of your study, about any limitations in your findings, and you also want to be really careful about the language you use.
Right.
Making sure you're not reinforcing stereotypes.
So instead of saying like Western or Eastern cultures, be more specific.
Exactly. Talk about the specific cultural groups you studied.
And their unique characteristics.
Right.
And, of course, the paper is a big fan of those COG statements.
Yes, those constraints on generality statements.
Yeah, can you remind us why those are so important?
Sure. So COG statements basically help researchers acknowledge the limits of their research.
Okay.
And avoid making claims that might not be true for other populations.
Right. It's about being humble.
Yeah, exactly. Saying, hey, we found this, but it might not apply everywhere.
And encouraging other researchers to do more research.
Exactly.
To see if it holds up in different contexts.
Right.
So it's acknowledging that our knowledge is always evolving. Okay, so we've talked about acknowledging limitations, being careful with our language.
Yeah.
But what about this idea of generalizing our findings?
Okay.
That seems really tricky, given that, certain populations have been overrepresented in research in the past.
It is tricky, and the paper really pushes back against those questionable generalizability practices.
The QGPs.
Yeah, the QGPs.
Right.
So basically, researchers need to be super careful about generalizing to groups that weren't actually in their study.
That makes sense. It's about being really cautious.
Yeah.
And not overstating what your data can actually tell you.
Exactly.
So it's about being honest with ourselves and with the scientific community.
Yes.
About what our research can and can't say about human behavior.
Totally.
And finally, the paper also talks about the need for more diversity in the people who are evaluating research.
Right.
Like peer reviewers and editorial boards.
Yes, absolutely.
Why is that so important?
So having a more diverse group of people evaluating research, it helps to ensure that research from underrepresented groups gets a fair hearing.
Okay.
And that a wider range of perspectives are shaping the field as a whole.
So it's about creating a more level playing field
Exactly.
where everyone's voice can be heard.
Right. And in the end, that leads to a richer and more accurate understanding of human behavior for everyone.
This deep dive has really got me thinking like, wow, there's so much more to open science than I initially realized.
Yeah, it's definitely more than just like putting your data online.
Right, it's about like a whole different way of approaching research.
Yeah, it's about expanding our definition of what good science even means.
That's interesting.
It's not just about, rigorous methods and stats. It's about ethics inclusivity, thinking about the impact of our work on different communities.
Yeah, it makes you realize, like, we have a responsibility as researchers
To
make sure our work actually benefits everyone.
Exactly. A globally diverse and inclusive open science,
Yeah.
it could help us understand human behavior so much better.
And make our research more relevant to more people.
Exactly. Imagine the kind of breakthroughs we could have if we could harness the knowledge and experiences of people from all walks of life.
It's a pretty inspiring vision for the future of psychology.
Is.
I hope our listeners are feeling as fired up as I am to be part of this.
You too.
So where can people go to learn more about these ideas?
Well, if you're interested in learning more, we've got links to the full manifesto on our website and also to that missing majority dashboard we talked about.
Awesome. Those are great resources for anyone who wants to dive deeper.
Definitely.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today for this deep dive into the future of psychological science.
It was my pleasure.
And to all our listeners out there, until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep pushing for a more inclusive and equitable world.